Everybody knows now that the streets of Portland, Oregon erupted in protest for racial justice. What's the real story? Stay tuned. I'm Burt Cohen, and with your help, we are keeping democracy alive. Portland, Oregon in 2020. What images does that bring up for you? Well, guess what? The image we get from the mainstream media is hardly the real, full story. Trump has used photographs, allegedly, of Portland burning, but who knows where they're really from. His campaign is relying on building violence, creating and manipulating fear. But what is the reality in that northwestern city? And what does it say about the two distinct political narratives across the country leading up to November 3rd? With us today from that city at the leading edge of American politics, Portland, Oregon, is David Rovics. Thanks so much for being with us on Keeping Democracy Alive.
My pleasure. Thank you, Brett.
Well, David Rovics is a songwriter. It was fun to learn about you. A songwriter, musician, blogger, and podcaster based in Portland, Oregon. Since the 90s, David has been touring regularly throughout North America, Europe, and occasionally elsewhere, playing on stages large and small at protests and festivals, as well as in squatted social centers and folk clubs. He's recorded dozens of albums and had millions of his songs viewed, streamed, and downloaded. He hosts two regular podcasts, Song for Today and This Week with David Rovics. And he writes regularly for Dissident Voice, Counterpunch, and Fifth Estate. And he's a wobbly, a member of the Industrial Workers of the World, which I have always admired. One big union. Anyway, nice bio there. The networks and the news media need action, fires, and violence, so it grabs headlines and precious seconds of broadcast time. According to your piece in Counterpunch titled Escalation in Portland, protests have been taking place every night for over 3 months. I assume the flashpoint was the same one as happened in so many other cities across America, the police murder of George Floyd. But Portland's protests have been unique. You write that prior to Trump, prior to the pandemic, Portland was a city experiencing multiple crises. We don't know that. Tell us about that, please, and how that all set the stage.
Well, I mean, I guess I wouldn't necessarily say that the crises Portland was facing are unique, although the whole overall Portland is, there are aspects of Portland and Oregon that are unique, but generally the crisis that was going on in Portland was the same crisis that was happening in Seattle, San Francisco, New York City, Boston, which is the housing being completely unaffordable for the average, family or person. And so what we've seen has been just massive dislocation and disruption of life in the city. And that's been true of so many other of those rapidly gentrifying cities where, neighborhoods just completely are unrecognizable within years, So Portland has lost more than half of its Black population between the last two censuses.
Wow. And I remember in Boston in the 60s, there was something called urban renewal, which was supposedly making the city better. Of course, it did exactly that. It destroyed whole neighborhoods, and and once it's gone, it's gone. And it makes it less of a vibrant place to have, less diversity within a town. How did you come up with the title Escalation in Portland? Who's escalating? What do you mean by that?
Well, it's this, basically the dynamic that's been happening. Well, there's different aspects of. The specific escalation that I was talking about is the death of the shooting death of a far right member of a group called Patriot Prayer that was killed on August 29th in downtown Portland when the Trump cruise came to Portland, which was 600 pickup trucks with over 1,000 people altogether, many of them armed with automatic weapons and bear mace and all sorts of other things with big American flags on the back of their pickup trucks. And they did a cruise from the suburbs of Portland into the city of Portland. And they were met by folks who, were opposed to their being Sure. There.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately they were attacking people in the streets, and as they do regularly when they come to town. And this is also not necessarily unique to Portland, but it's true in a lot of cities in the U.S. and in other countries, that when the far right comes to town, the police often, if there's only a few of them, then the police will tend to protect them from everybody else. But if there's a lot of them, then the police will tend to vacate the area and just let them do their thing, on the premise, I think, in the minds of the police, that these are basically cops. They're just like amateur cops. They're sort of deputized, and they're treated like that by the police. So then that's a recipe for disaster, of course. Sure. So and then eventually, there's going to be people killed. And then what we saw in Kenosha was a very similar kind of dynamic, and where two people were killed, and by a far right guy who came to be so supposedly protecting property. And then what happened in Portland was a far right guy was killed, and so then the police had a warrant out for the guy that they thought to the killing in an act of self-defense. And then police from several different agencies, municipal and federal and state, I believe, all descended on the apartment that this guy, Michael Reynolds, was staying in near Lacey, Washington, outside of Olympia. And they, according to now new witness statements, which is new since that article I wrote, new witness statements indicate quite clearly that he was just executed in a hail of bullets by the police who came to kill him, not to arrest him. They fired 40 bullets. They all went in his direction. He was not resisting. They claim he was trying to get away. That's very unclear whether that was true at all, but he was not resisting. They just came and executed him. So that's the particular escalation I was referring to, although there's also lots of other escalation in terms of just like every time people take to the streets in what is essentially very basic civil disobedience tactic of marching in the streets. They're met with overwhelming violence coming from the police in the form of tear gas and rubber coated steel bullets and all sorts of stuff. And that's what the people who aren't at the protests may not realize, that all over this country, the overwhelming majority of the time, when the police are attacking people, they are attacking people for taking to the streets, not for destroying any property, but just for marching in the streets. And generally, any property destruction that happens tends to happen after people have been violently assaulted multiple times by the police. And then what they call property destruction oftentimes is people just trying to get to put debris in the road so that there's barricades. And then barricades are most effective when they're burning. And this is not anything that was just invented in Portland. Like anybody who's been around, if you've traveled much, if you've been to other protests, other uprisings, other riots in other countries, it's a very commonly understood principle that if you want to stop the police from just rampaging around and attacking everybody wanton, violent, this kind of, you need to be able to have physical barriers between you and them. And so that's what people are doing. It's nothing like just random destruction. It's very targeted, principled, use of objects to create. And then of course it involves things getting destroyed that maybe somebody didn't want to have destroyed. But when you look at downtown Portland, it's overwhelmingly corporate businesses property that are getting damaged on a regular basis. It's the rioters, whatever you want to call people who do that kind of thing, tend to be a very principled bunch around here. Although there's always, you can't never account for everybody who's in a crowd and provocateurs and such.
Oh gosh! Of course, there's provocateurs. I'm old enough to remember May Day 1971 when we had a protest against the war in Vietnam, and we were trying to block traffic, symbolically close down the
Right.
center of the war-making machine. And the provocateurs were so obvious. It was amazing. Saying,
Right.
hey, let's throw rocks at the police. And they also
Right.
had their bell bottoms were too short and they were neatly pressed.
Oh my God, yeah. It's so funny. They've gotten a bit better I think, but I've heard so many stories like that from the '60s, especially, and like that the cops, the undercover cops, often you just look at the shoes and see what their shoes look like, because they never would wear like raggedy old sneakers. They'd be wearing like shoes that are sort of, shined and stuff, even if the rest of the outfit was trying to look like a hippie or something. Yeah, and they're usually a lot bigger. Like at least around here, at least in terms of like the sort of the black bloc crowd that's doing a lot of the barricades and stuff. I mean, it tends to be scrawny teenagers, So and the cops are never teenagers; they're always older than that. So that kind of gives them away, to some extent. Even if they otherwise get the dress code, they're usually like about 50% large than the average black bloc member, at least, and they're older. So,
Well, who is Black Bloc? Bloc or Black Bloc? I haven't heard that in a while. There's
Black Bloc?
Bloc, yeah.
Yeah, Black Bloc. I mean, I guess, I guess there's so many of these terms, right? And I guess it depends on your kind of, when you first, I don't know who's using what terms these days, but Black Bloc is still a commonly used term around sort of some anarchist circles here and in other parts of the U.S. And it was more commonly used in the 90s and around the global justice movement. And it is basically virtually inexchangeable with Antifa and for all practical purposes, but Antifa, but you could perhaps make distinctions, but it's basically that. You could say that milieu and people who believe in those sorts of militant tactics. But at the global justice, when the protests against the IMF and the World Bank and the WTO and stuff like that used to be a common thing going on like 20 years ago, they generally involve. As with many other protests, they generally involve a mix of people involved with different sorts of tactics, and the Black Bloc are the ones that are generally annoying the organizers who wanted everything to be, peaceful and harmonious, because they're the ones who are putting the dumpsters into the street and lighting them on fire and that sort of thing. So that's the Black Bloc, and they exist in that sort of element is in some countries, depending on the situation. They don't dress in black. They're not necessarily young, and sometimes they're the majority. Sometimes those kinds of tactics are so commonplace that you wouldn't call it Black Bloc tactics, because it's just how people protest in Oaxaca, for example. But if you're talking about the North American or European context, then it tends to be they're younger. They tend to be wearing black, and they tend to be destroying property, as a matter of principle.
Well, there's, it's a fight, and there've been, the use of barriers has gone on for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's just part of what happens. And there's so much more to talk about. Burt Cohen here. The show is Keeping Democracy Alive. Our guest today is David Rovics from Portland, Oregon. We're trying to see really from the rest of the country, look at what's really going on in Portland, aside from the images. And, there is resistance, there is action on the streets. And I wonder, and I do want to talk about these so-called liberated zones eventually, but most people, I think, remember that Trump poured in a whole bunch of secret federal police, grabbing people off the street, throwing them into unmarked vans, things like that we wouldn't normally think of as this country. We'd think of, Soviet Russia or North Korea or something like that. But I'm thinking that the reason they sent in these secret federal police was so they could get video of violence for TV ads. And in fact, that is exactly what they did. As a matter of fact, just yesterday, I got this email from the Trump-Pence campaign. It sure is interesting being on their email list, I'll tell you. This is from what they sent. The radical far left, all caps, of course, Joe Biden and Kamala have, all caps, refused to denounce the radical violent groups of protesters destroying, again, all caps, destroying our American cities all over the nation by instead referring to them as peaceful protesters. And, you know, violence, of course, does play on people's fears. And Trump depends on fear, on the manipulation of fear, creating violence, ratcheting up fear. Yet, in the past, as you point out, that in Northern Ireland, protests started out as peaceful, but then, as you write, it was met with tremendous violence. Your thoughts on that? And talk about that whole, you know, the media loves the violence, and Trump made ads showing violence, and who knows where the heck it's from. You've talked a little bit about the history of that, but what about the example of Northern Ireland that you wrote about?
Well, yeah, the question right now, I think, in terms of violence, in reality, like on the ground, not in Trump's fantasies or in our mayor's fantasies, who we call him Tear Gas Ted, the mayor here. But whether we're talking about supposedly liberal democratic fantasies or Trump's fascistic fantasies, what's really happening on the ground is the police forces of these Democrat-run cities. And of course, the vast majority of cities are run by Democrats. And the reason is because when you have popular representation, when there's more democracy, more Democrats win, which is, I'm not saying anything, heaping praise on the Democratic Party by any means, but they are a more popular party than the Republican Party among the population. So of course, most cities are run by Democrats, just to, point that out. But these cities run by Democrats. Who are these Democrats who run these cities? Mayor Ted Wheeler is very representative of that class of people. He's wealthy, sixth generation timber baron money, and that's very normal. And it is the landlord gentry elite who are actually the majority of the legislature in the state. They're millionaires and they are big property owners. These cities are all just basically real estate investments for the people that run them and for the investors that are making trillions of dollars off of the gentrification of this country, which is one of the biggest, most profitable industries in the world. That's the context, right? And this property that they're so concerned about being destroyed. This, that's who owns it. And the police here have been under Democratic rule for over a century, and they've been attacking people constantly. It's their normal way of operating is to violently assault people. And this is nothing new. This goes way back. So then you have the federal forces coming in and doing the same. And that inspired a lot more opposition, because basically there's a lot of people who don't understand what's happening because they weren't out on the street. And they don't realize that the Democratic Party runs these police forces that are attacking people all the time, just like the Republicans do. But it's when the federal troops come in and start snatching people from the streets, it starts getting lots of national media attention. The question before the federal troops came was already irrelevant. The question of at what point is it so unsafe to have a demonstration that involves marching in the streets, or maybe even not marching in the streets, that you can be attacked by the far right or by police or by both and killed and attacked with people driving vehicles into parks. And this is happening all over the country. So at what point is the atmosphere so fomented by Trump and his fascists, that it gets to the point where people are attacking you so regularly, then getting praised after they kill people, like in Kenosha? At what point is it just too unsafe to even think that it's possible to have demonstrations in any kind of traditional sense? Of course people are wearing body armor now when they go out to demonstrate. Of course they are carrying guns with them now. That's what it's come to. And,
that's exactly what Trump wants it to look like. And it makes it very difficult for the traditional DNC type Democrats, it makes it a difficult position for them to be in because obviously they want to gather the votes from moderate to conservative Democrats. And there's a lot of fear. And I have to mention, you talk about history a little bit. I always, not always, but often bring up my old political science professor who defined politics as the economy of violence. The police can be violent, and it really, the violent forces are there. What about that invasion by the secret federal forces? What was that like? What was the effect of that? And did the people in the suburbs, did they feel frightened by this invasion, do you think? The white people, middle to upper class people, did they feel frightened by this, rather fascistic invasion?
No, I think overwhelmingly the feeling among people in the suburbs was outrage. And they of course, it was also that it was getting a lot of media attention. There's a bit of a chicken egg phenomenon there. I mean, what it seems like, what I've observed around Portland, having in the time that I've lived here, is when the mainstream media is covering something and everybody knows it's really happening, then there are always at any given time many thousands of people from the suburbs who want to come and show their support for whatever's going on, for some kind of change. There's a lot of radicals who believe that things need to be to change in radical ways, who are ready to come commit acts of civil disobedience. They're ready to get tear gas. They're ready to take the streets, but they need to know what's happening. There needs to be some level of organization, whether that's happening through organizers or because the media is telling everybody about it. So like when it was clear, like say back in Occupy Wall Street, that the police were going to raid the Occupy camp, and they set a date and time for it. It was convenient that they set a date and time, and that was mentioned on local Oregon public radio and probably mentioned on other media. And lo and behold, that was all it took to get 5,000 people out there at midnight to defend the Occupy encampment. So I mean, the support is out there, and that's been very clear since there was loads of media attention when when it was clear that there were federal troops, snatching people off the street, because they were there for a couple of weeks doing this stuff without it being confirmed by the mainstream media. And once Oregon Public Broadcasting confirmed that this was happening, and then the rest of the mainstream media was able to, then admit that this was really happening, then it became, big, huge news. And then I think a lot of people who, they came out to oppose that because they knew it was going on. I don't know if, if they necessarily think that everything was just fine before, or if they don't have their own, critique of the Portland Police Department or the mayor or something, but certainly the federal involvement, the size of the protests multiplied by 10 times or more.
I love it. I'm reminded once again, an old guy telling stories from the olden days. The best organizer of the anti-war movement back then was Nixon. He brought us together. Yeah. He did. He said absolutely. And it seems to be, from what you're saying here, the invasion by the federal forces united a lot of people. And obviously, I wasn't there. I can't help but think that many people, including whites from middle and upper economic classes, were present in the anti-racism protests. And I wonder, did it help to create a sense of unity, of everybody from different economic classes sharing the same fight?
Certainly, at least from what, you can hear so many voices from so many Black people across the country who are frequently talking about how one of the reasons why the movement that exists now has gotten as much attention as it's gotten has been because of the constant, daily ongoing participation of white people in the movement as well, because of course the Black Lives Matter marches in 2014, 2015, they were going on a very regular basis, but they were overwhelmingly black, the participants, and throughout the country. Although that wasn't always the case at all the demos, but that has changed, as many people have observed.
He's bringing us together, no doubt about that. There's so much news every day, moving so quickly. Many listeners probably have just a vague memory of a liberated or autonomous zone in Portland. I'm very interested in hearing about what that was all about, how it happened, what groups were behind it, what it was like, and its status today. And there was something, I guess it started out with something with the police building. Tell us about that autonomous zone.
So you're thinking of the CHOP in Seattle, actually,
and
there were no, that's all right. But there were efforts there have been ongoing efforts, basically, for the past 105 nights or so, to recreate something along the lines of the CHOP in Seattle, which is now gone. Of course, the police reoccupied the building in Seattle, but really, I think that's one of the biggest things that's sort of, it's not like, I don't know if it's a misunderstanding or if there's just not a lot of communication about intentions, or if people believe that the physical efforts that are being made should communicate without words. The sort of communication of the deed, but basically whether or not it's being clearly, sort of presented way. I would say that in order to understand what's going on in Portland and what has at times been going on in Seattle and many other cities in the country, is when we see the police stations being burned or destroyed or occupied. In many cases, the people who are talking about defunding the police or who are destroying a police station because it was the police station where a particular killer cop who just killed somebody was based out of. There's people who see the point in many ways, symbolically and tactically, of just destroying police stations, and that the act of destroying police stations has a very long history around the world as an act of resistance. The other thing about it, about the efforts that are going on, the goal for many people is not necessarily to destroy the police stations, but to do like what you are talking about in Seattle and occupy it. And what happened in Seattle was the police got orders to just abandon the station rather than basically use the station as a backdrop for pitched battles every night involving massive amounts of tear gas. And there were, political thinkers among the Seattle establishment who thought, okay, we can maybe do something better here. We don't necessarily need to hold on to the building if it's going to be such a big controversial thing. We can just retreat to other police stations and let them take this building and do what they want with it. And this kind of decision making actually has lots and lots of precedent. And this kind of decision making, as recently as just a few years ago in Denmark, this is exactly what the Danish political elite did in order to quell ongoing protests among Danish youth. They gave them a building. That has a lot of history in Germany and Switzerland and a lot of different countries having to do with the autonomous movement and squatting buildings and stuff. And we don't have that kind of history outside of New York City so much in recent history in terms of squatting. But the idea is reclaiming space, taking space that is public or that is used for nefarious purposes like a police station, and then doing useful things with it, turning it into a community center, gardens, housing for the homeless, all kinds of stuff you can do with it that's useful other than having a gang of thugs there to occupy your city, which we don't need.
No, they often do a lot of damage, and I can't help but think that a lot of times the police themselves, they're people too, and they recognize that they're called into situations that somebody else could handle better, that they don't need to be, using violence to do this, that, I think defunding was an unfortunate word, but just changing the funding, redirecting the funding, stuff like that. I can't help but think that in Portland, where people have seen what goes on, and the more in the big cities where people see, excessive police violence, they're starting to recognize, they take a lot of the budget. Any idea? The schools, the public education is always the largest line item in a budget. Do you have any sense of how large the budget for police is in your city of Portland?
I don't remember the percentage. I know that throughout the country, it is usually the biggest piece of the budget, as much as 40-50% of typical city budgets is the police. Yeah. And I don't think it's any different here in Portland. And I think, the idea of having not having the need for a police force, it is really, there's so many things that in order to really think about them and imagine them effectively, you don't need to rely on fiction, but you do need to look outside of the boundaries of this country. And, so I run into this a lot, including among intelligent radicals, well-meaning people who are maybe pragmatic, not quite so utopian, and aren't ready to just embrace the concept that that just sounds like a good idea without having really thought it through. But defunding the police, I think, is a wonderful idea, and it's easy to say that as somebody who has thought it through. And I can say that just based on the fact that I have spent much of my adult life traveling and playing music in other countries. And those other countries primarily are countries in Europe. And in Europe, they don't spend so much of their budgets on the police. They also don't spend much at all on the military. Right. And instead, what they do with their budgets is they have social services, and they have lots of people working for the state who do things like build housing, look after children and drug addicts and the elderly. And they have massive numbers of social workers in the typical European country, so many that they have so many different names for different social workers. We don't even have these names. We don't even know what they are, even when you translate it into English. It's like whole professions that exist in social democracies that just don't even exist here. And, public health, public mental health, all this kind of stuff, and you have many societies where forced eviction is illegal. In the United States, 1 out of 10 renters is forcibly evicted every year, or at least threatened with forced eviction. They are evicted, and which can be and that's totally disruptive and horrible all over the country. And there are other ways that landlords can potentially collect their rent, but not from indigent renters who can't afford to pay their rent. And in other countries, when you have that kind of situation, the government steps in and takes action and funds things. And, there's other ways you can get money from somebody, whether they're employed or not, in a functional state. In
a functional state, right.
Yeah, and landlords have a lot fewer rights in functional states. They don't have the right to just make all the money they want and just kick people out and have them be homeless. But this whole country is a failed state. But when you don't live in a failed state, then you don't need to rely on armed police to solve all your problems. You don't need police to evict people. You don't need police to solve mental health crises either, or any number of other things that they're constantly called for.
Yeah, interesting point. And I think more people, there are occasional turning points in history, very, very rare. I'm starting to think and have some degree of hope that the George Floyd murder was one of those turning points. People, I think, are starting to realize, dealing with homeless people, arresting them, picking them up, there's other ways to do it. You're starting to see more housing being built. And some people are like, what? Giving them housing? Well, yeah. And taking care of mental issues. There's other ways to do it other than calling in the police. And I think, Portland, Oregon is one of those places where it's starting to happen. And, a little bit of history here. I know I keep going back to history. What can I say? I love history. I was in Oregon only once in 1968 with Outward Bound in the gorgeous, beautiful Three Sisters Wilderness, which I hope is still pristine. It's fabulous. And that's my only image of this state. Apparently that was a very incomplete picture. You say Oregon was founded as a white homeland, and Portland was a national home to organized racism for a long time. What? Tell us about that, please.
I mean, yeah. So, well, I mean, basically, when it is somewhat complicated in terms of the whole white homeland thing, But basically, Portland, this state of Oregon, was basically all the. I mean, backing up a little bit, broadly here, all the settlement of the West, all the states that were settled in the course of the expansion of this very expansionistic country, this empire. As the U.S. was expanding, the unwritten, I think it was unwritten. Certainly, it was a rule, and it was very much practiced. And I'm not sure if it was written, but the rule was you couldn't even have a chance at becoming a state until you had a white settler majority, and that was true everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
But in Oregon, this was not only, of course, could Oregon not apply for statehood until it had the requisite white settler majority, but Oregon also went further and had laws around property ownership and different jobs who could or couldn't work based on your race, which was defined very specifically. It was, I think, one of the earlier efforts at defining whiteness. And there were also definitions of different kinds of Mexican, because from the very beginning of the state of Oregon, there have been Mexicans, Spanish-speaking people who identified as Mexican, and in the state constitution they are divided into a caste, system of white Mexicans and black Mexicans, and they have different rights depending on whether they were determined to be white or black Mexicans. And according to Native people, there was a special exemption for Native people. If you were half Native, you could own property, and that was if you had other racial mixes in you, then you needed to have less than half of the non-white race in order to own property. But if you were Native, then you could be half Native, but full Native, no. Then you had no rights. So that was all in the state constitution, and there were also people who disobeyed the rules and were living and working in the state who were not white were officially the official punishment was for them to be publicly flogged every 6 months until they left. But unofficially, there were signs around the towns, cities in Oregon up until within living memory of some people that said basically people who are not white should leave town by sunset or you'll be lynched. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. And one of the things I've learned from history, well, of course, the biggest thing to learn from history is that people don't learn from history, but the resistance to bringing slavery out to many Western states was actually because not so much they were against slavery, they just didn't want black people there. They didn't want black people there.
Yeah. They didn't want black people here. That was the thing about not wanting slavery, was not wanting black people. But to just slightly in defense of these sort of what you would rightly call white supremacist settlers, the part of the thing with the isolationism, in a way, the racial isolationism, is also not to have to compete with free labor on the assumption that there was something automatically always free about any black labor. Inevitably, that blacks were inevitably. So there's a racist thinking in that blacks were inevitably going to be slaves because that's just their sort of natural state, but this not wanting to have to deal with the whole institution. So part of that, for some people might have been, there might have been some aspect of something positive about this not wanting slavery. I mean, I doubt there were any. I don't know how many people would have been, actual abolitionists, because this state was not settled primarily by abolitionists. It was settled by people who who they moved here and they started naming towns things like Jacksonville and Selma. Yeah.
Yeah, people think, some people think, that racist stuff was only in the South. I wish.
Right.
And
yeah.
Some people have painted the protests in Portland as not legitimate protests, but as riots. How would you answer that? If you hear people say that, how would you respond?
I would say that the dynamic that people need to understand that's happening in Portland and other cities most of the time when you're talking about what they call riots, and maybe we can distinguish here between the first 1 or 2 or 3 nights after a police execution, such as George Floyd. The dynamics for the first few days after something like that are different, and maybe involve much more targeted property destruction and perhaps not targeted property destruction, depending on who's destroying the property, who's involved, who's coming from out of town, what kind of provocateurs are involved. It's all very complicated, big mess, and it's hard to say. But when you're talking about what they call riots in Portland most of the time, to differentiate from, the sort of torching of much of that neighborhood in the Lakeside neighborhood in Minneapolis, for example, what's been going on in Portland generally is much more along the lines of people march down the street after having a rally in a park with people speaking and stuff. Then people march down in the streets, and then they're either at some point allowed to march around without being attacked, and then at some point, unpredictably, maybe in minutes into the march or maybe hours into the march, they will be assaulted by gangs of riot police, sometimes with notification and other times without notification. And sometimes the police will attack people just for being on the sidewalk in the wrong area. And they will frequently attack medics, legal observers, and journalists, just as freely as they attack everybody else. And they're constantly getting sued, and they're constantly losing lawsuits, and they just keep on doing it anyway. Yeah,
because it's not in their budget. It's not in the police budget. The municipal taxpayers have to pick that up oftentimes. And in terms of pictures that's been broadcast on TV of violence, certainly there's some, as you've described, burning barricades, things like that,
which makes for great media. Burning barricades
makes for great media. Fires, yeah, we love it. But what about any sense, you're there in Portland, of who's been doing more of the violent stuff, the right wing or what is now called the left, which used to be kind of the center? But what's your sense of who's really initiating disturbing violence? Any guess on that?
Well, I mean, if you're talking about the center in terms of the left, if you're talking about the electoral left, I mean, I wouldn't refer to them as left, but
right.
And, I mean, and with the left, when we're talking about people protesting, we're not talking about Democrats. They're generally people who have really who are outraged by both parties. Yeah. These are people who would generally be. I mean, Occupy Wall Street happened when there was a Democrat in the White House. It's well known around here that the Democrats make more money than the Republicans on average. And that's a fact, by the way. Yeah. The Congress, the average person in the Congress is $4,000. The average Democrat in the Congress is $4,000 wealthier than the average Republican in terms of their net worth, and that's a fact. And that's just we have these misconceptions about the two parties and their leadership, and there may be a lot of truth to these misconceptions when we're talking about their base. There's probably more working class support in the Democratic Party, but the leadership is very much an elite, and that's very much true here in Portland. The Democratic leadership, as represented by the mayor, and he's reviled. He's reviled. So that's
Well, the violence on the streets there, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the violence on the streets there, some of it's coming from the police, some of it's coming from not police. Who's doing more violence?
Yeah, so the way I would break it down basically is the overwhelming majority. The violence that's being committed against human beings is being committed, which is what many of us would define as violence, as opposed to violence against inanimate objects. But when we're talking about violence against human beings, that is almost entirely being committed by the police.
Right.
And to the extent that it's not police, it's right-wing thugs attacking people. There's also some degree of people defending themselves against the right-wing thugs when the police are totally absent, because the police are not there to get in between people, so people have to defend themselves. And so that's what's been happening, is when it came down to the Patriot Prayer guy getting shot, that was a question of people who, someone who is involved with the role of playing security in the demos. And the demos are very well organized, and there's people who play different roles. There's little, it's a very well organized in the anarchist sense of where people form affinity groups that have different sort of responsibilities. They don't need to coordinate with each other. They don't need to have an overall director. They know what their role is, and they do their fundraising and they get their equipment. So there's people who give away free food. There's other people who give away free medical care. Other people who do free legal help. Other people, there's a whole network of different people doing different kinds of things at the protest to sort of keep things going. But there is also people doing security, and there are people oftentimes very large people on motorcycles, and who are wonderful allies of the movement, who are, if you're going to attack anybody, if you're going to attack the crowd with a vehicle, you're going to drive through some very big people on very large motorcycles. Basically, that is the arrangement, much of the time. But so the person, when the Patriot Prayer guy got shot, that was a case of basically somebody doing security who felt that people's lives were being threatened, and made that probably very hasty decision to use the loaded gun that he had on him, which is not uncommon these days, because the right wingers are coming in with loaded guns, and so there are elements among the protesters as well, who also are not pacifists by any means, and also are carrying guns. But the violence against people is overwhelmingly police. And when we're talking about property, if we're talking about people who want to occupy the police stations, which is a regular thing that keeps on happening here in different neighborhoods, where people organize what the Youth Liberation Front calls a direct action march, which means they're going to march down the street, and then they're going to basically do stuff around the police station, and different people will do different things. Sure. Mostly they'll just get attacked by the police, but
sounds like a good time.
Yeah, really. But then some people may also try to set barricades alight and basically break windows in the police station and get into the police station with I think the ultimate goal is to turn it into an occupied sort of autonomous zone, like the CHOP in Seattle. It just never gets to that point here, because there's never enough numbers, and the police are always too violent, and so it just turns into these constant nightly skirmishes outside of police stations in different parts of the city. But the violence is all the police, and unless you call a burning dumpster violent.
Well, we've heard about the Wall of Moms. Tell us about that, and how the police and federal forces dealt with them.
When the federal forces were here, they are still here, right? But when the federal forces were in the forefront of attacking people, and to the point where the local police largely sort of took nights off from attacking people downtown, because the federal forces were doing it so with such wanton brutality that even the local police, who are very well known for wanton brutality, just were like, okay, if they're not going to coordinate with us, we'll just, sit this out, basically. But when the federal forces were here snatching people off the street and attacking people with lasers and all sorts of, space age weapons, there's a really bizarre stuff going on. This was like, it was like beyond the normal realm of police, and sort of going into the sort of dirty war type of scenario, except they weren't actually torturing and killing people. They were, abducting them and holding them for a few hours and interrogating them, then letting them go. So it's sort of like practice run for disappearances, but it scared a lot of people to the point where it got them mobilized in the streets and in their thousands every night, and that included the group that was calling itself the Wall of Moms, and that was largely suburban moms who organized as a group and were so a lot of different groups.
Sure. I love that.
Started coming out basically because they were like, I think that some of them probably had unrealistic ideas about inserting themselves between the mostly teenagers and folks in their 20s who are getting constantly attacked by the police every night, and sort of like and who are also include relatively large numbers of people of color, and they a lot of these groups, largely from the suburbs, wanted to get involved and say like, oh, we're here, okay, if you're going to attack people your own age, who live in the same suburbs as you do, which I think was powerfully symbolic and made a lot of media. And then what made it even more media was that the fact that the police just the federal forces just attacked them, and they attacked the mayor. I mean, when the mayor came to the federal building, they attacked him too. And he is an elitist, tear gas loving mayor. So they attacked him. They made it look good, which pissed the rest of us off because he's tear gassed Ted, and he shouldn't be made to look good, but he did. He looked good for that night.
Well, that's one thing.
Coughing.
Oh my goodness, you got to be smart about that. You have to, it's good to be strategic and figure things out. Not everybody does that, for sure. People just react, understandably, and don't always think through. But I love the affinity groups thing. That's I have an affinity for affinity groups from way back, from a long time ago. Now, if people understand what fascism is, which many do not, nearly everyone would be against fascism. Again, once they understand what it is. Some on the left see a well-organized fascist fighting machine. You talked, in your article, you talked with University of Massachusetts professor Graciela Monteagudo, I hope I pronounced that right, who said the fascist comparisons aren't so relevant. Now, from what you've seen in Portland, how competent and well-oiled is the fascistic side?
Well, I mean, I think that the point that she was making is that, I mean, and I've since talking to her, I've been asking other people that question, like, Graciela said this, what do you think? And I've gotten interesting different responses from other people, like Arun Gupta, who was saying that the point about fascism isn't that the fascists are so competent at being fascist, that they're fascists. And so, I don't think Graciela would disagree that they're fascists necessarily, but the point she's making is that they're really incompetent fascists, which is a relevant point to make. And I've often made this. I mean, when you think about what they accomplished in Germany, and Germany wasn't. There's been a lot of fascist regimes in the history of the world, and they've varied wildly from really kleptocratic and relatively incompetent ones, which to no small extent, maybe you could say includes Mussolini's Italy, but certainly includes a lot of Latin American dictatorships. And then there have been others, which with Germany being the top example during the World War II of being really well organized and really really not corrupt and really popular among much of the population at first. So that was the German model is clearly the one that a lot of real fascists would like to emulate, but it's not what they actually do.
Well, let's hear it for the incompetents. That may be our saving grace. Your last,
I hope so.
Oh my goodness! Your last paragraph in the article starts out this way: either way, if there's a point at which we realize we are taking our lives in our hands by just going downtown and marching in the streets, this might be it. Please say more of what you mean there. That's big.
Yeah, I mean that's. I think that like we're getting to the question of Northern Ireland that we touched on before. That like at the point when the Irish civil rights movement was going on in the late '60s, when Catholics were marching for their rights in a society that was really a caste society where Catholics were totally oppressed, and Protestants got all the good jobs, and all the cops were Protestant, and et cetera, et cetera. You know, it was a a racialized society, and between Protestant and Catholic. And when the Catholics, the civil rights movement was very consciously modeled after the civil rights movement in the United States, and led by clergy, and people were marching peacefully in the streets. And just like in the United States, they were violently attacked by racist Protestants and violently attacked by police. And ultimately, just like in the United States, sort of their equivalent of like federal troops were brought in, which in the form of the British troops, but they weren't, they were very partisan themselves. Right. And ultimately, you had a situation where basically Catholics trying to march peacefully in the streets were being massacred. And of course, you had Bloody Sunday is well known, where 13 leaders, organizers, not just random 13 people, but 13 organizers of the march were sought out by the British military and executed in broad daylight. That's Bloody Sunday. But prior to Bloody Sunday, there were in cities across the country, inspired by fake news put out by the British government about non-existent terrorist activities and all sorts of things. They whipped up an atmosphere, which wasn't that hard to whip up in the first place because of the caste society that already existed. But they whipped up an atmosphere such that, Protestant mobs were burning down Catholic houses in cities throughout Northern Ireland. And it was pogroms. There were thousands of refugees. There were hundreds of buildings burned. This was the atmosphere that, led to the formation of the armed resistance movement and led to people there realizing that peaceful protest was not working and was not going to work, because if you were just going to get shot down, So, I mean, we're not in that. No. We haven't pogroms, but what we are having is regularly right-wing fanatics driving vehicles into crowds of people and causing serious injuries and occasionally death. And what we are having is right-wing fanatics with automatic weapons shooting people regularly at protests. So, now that's, it's a different situation.
But it's perhaps kind of early. And here in New Hampshire, we have 400 members of the House. Some of them are really out there. And this one guy recently said, if you see a house with the Black Lives Matter sign, you can go in and burn it down. I'm serious. He's going to be taken out. Well, you are also, aside from a political activist, a musician, songwriter. How can people hear your songs? We're going to play one at the end, but how can people go to the internet thingy and find your music?
Oh, yeah, as long as they can spell my name, or even if they misspell it, they'll come across my music. That's all they need to do. DavidRovics.com, or, they can look me up on Spotify or wherever. Well, I'm on all the usual platforms.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being with us. And it's good to hear about what's going on there. And I sense a little bit of optimism in you as well as in me.
It's been 2 months now since that cop took a knee, like a knee upon the neck of a whole society. Folks rose up all over, starting there in the Midwest. The National Guard came in upon the governor's request. Whenever people took the streets, riot cops attacked, shooting folks there in their faces and their backs. Flooding streets with tear gas, see how the people stand with masks upon their faces and leaf blowers in their hands. There have been drive-by shootings and weaponizing trucks that the death count's what it is so far is partly up to luck and partly up to barricades used to block the way so folks might live to fight another day. That is lives if they're not killed by agents of the state, like the ones who came to Portland to make America great, to face a rainbow nation that says screw your white homeland, with masks upon their faces and leaf blowers in their hands. As they kidnap people off the streets here in the global north, as the tear gas billows, the poison belches forth, as those who would be dictators make their power play, as people from all over town face them down and say, we don't want police, a better world can be built. Perhaps it starts with someone's hand upon the hilt, making tornadoes out of tear gas, maybe not what mama planned, with masks upon their faces and leaf blowers in their hands.